So good morning, everyone. I'm Tim Lockie. I'm the administrator for the CCTSI. And I'm assuming that you guys are somewhat familiar with what the CCTSI is. My background is kind of an interesting course. I graduated from CU Boulder in the early 90s with a molecular biology degree and started my career as a clinical genetics counselor and got into laboratory and grant administration with a group of scientists that I was associated with. And ultimately, they started a biotech company that I went over to and worked at for a number of years. And we funded a lot of the activities of that biotech company with small SBIR grants and things like that, as well as product sales. And that was an interesting part of my career. And then I came here in 2003. So actually in July, I'll have my 20-year anniversary here at the university. And I started out as the administrator of a program that was called the General Clinical Research Center, the GCRC. And it was really focused around infrastructure to support clinical research. So the inpatient, outpatient facilities, things like that. And then we transitioned to this CTSA program, which is the basis of the CCTSI. So my background is really business, finance, grants management. And so that's the information that I'm going to give you guys today. It's a lot of information. Some of it's somewhat dry. The idea isn't that you know how to do this stuff. It's just that you kind of understand what some of the big issues are. You should all have, as you're embarking on writing grants and getting grants funded, you should all have some level of administrative support that you can draw on that would be providing financial detail for you, helping to prepare budgets, helping to submit grants. But, as a PI, really the buck stops with you anyways. And so you do need to understand kind of the big picture of what's going on, because ultimately it's your project to manage. And when things don't work right, you can't really point the fingers at too many people. Ultimately, you're the PI. So that's kind of the basis I'm coming from. I would prefer that if you have questions that you just interrupt me. It's easier to do that than deal with the chat and everything else. And I don't mind that at all. So then if I'm not being clear or you want more information about something, that would be great. So we've organized this into two parts. Laurent is recording this, and the idea is that we'll post this up on the CCTSI website as content that people can use access at their own speed. Many of the different training programs that we support, can all kind of have access to this information. So that's why we're recording it. We're doing it in two parts. One is kind of the pre-award, preparing a budget, preparing a grant kind of content. And then part two is more like, what's the responsibility you have as a PI? What does it mean to be audited, and how to track your budget for your funded project. And so that'll be post-award type stuff, and we'll take a break in between. So we'll just get started here. And let me see if I can figure out how to change this, advance these slides. So for this part one, wanted to give you guys a little idea of what realistic timelines are when you're thinking about writing a grant, submitting that grant, and when you might actually see money come in the door. What funding timelines would be, page limits, developing a budget. That's really where we'll spend kind of more time, just kind of giving you an idea of how I go about developing a budget for a grant, so that as you're thinking about this, you'll kind of have that as some context when you're meeting with the grants folks that will be supporting you as you prepare and submit that, and then some common documents that go into a standard grant. So standard application submission timelines. The takeaway here is that you should have in your head that you got about a 2-year window from the time that you're really, knowing that you've got to be working on preliminary data, gathering preliminary data that's going to support the project that you're going to present, to when you might have money coming in the door. So this is cut and pasted out of the kind of NIH instructions for standard standard submission timelines for like an RO1 that you might be wanting to submit that's not in response to a specific RFA or something. And so the point being is like if you had planned to submit in February of this year, then you would want to be thinking about preparing your preliminary data and whatnot 6 months ago, working and talking with people that you might be collaborating with, that kind of stuff, to be prepared to submit in February. You wouldn't actually get your reviewer comments back until July. And then you can see that you've already missed the next submission. So you couldn't really revise your application and submit. Most of the time you won't get funded on your first submission. And so you'll have to be looking at revising that that application, and you can't revise that application until you know what were some of the weaknesses that kept your score from being in the fundable range. So you've already missed the next deadline, and so then you would be preparing to submit in October, and you're not going to see money until next summer. So that's really kind of a 2-year window of time there. So it's just important that you have that kind of framework in your head as you're moving forward. And then internally, you have to develop and work with your grants team that's going to be supporting you at your own timeline for when you need to have documents ready at various stages. And so what I typically do is start with, okay, what's the submission deadline? Like, when do I absolutely have to have this at, let's just say, NIH? So hypothetically, if that was going to be at the end of February, you definitely want to make sure that your grant is submitted up to NIH 2 days before the due date, so that you have time for that grant to go through their internal checks and for them to spin back to you to say, hey, there's errors that have to be corrected. And so, I've learned that you want a little bit of a gap there. One of the things that I've also learned with grants and contracts is that, they don't work at night, and many of us do. And so if we're working on our grant application, it got submitted, at the end of the grants and contracts workday, you've received your response back electronically that says, hey, you've got some problems with this application. Well, grants and contracts has to flick a switch on their side before you can actually have access to it again to make your changes. That doesn't typically happen at 10 o'clock and midnight. So you're not going to get that until the next day. So you really want that couple of days in there. That's really important to give yourself a cushion. And then grants and contracts wants 10 days, 10 business days. They'll do it quicker than that, but that they want to see your application 10 business days before you're expecting to submit that. And so you build that in. And then you need time to get stuff from other people. I've listed things like bio sketches and letters of support here, but there's other people that are going to be helping you, kind of write this. So you want to build that kind of time in. You need time to work with the folks that, that are going to be supporting in your departments and divisions in submitting this application. So you'll have to check with them and, a number of weeks in advance to give them a heads up that, there's going to be an application that you're planning on that's going to hit their front door. And then, you've got this whole planning of, your preliminary data, your strategy, preparing documents, things like that. So you go back into that. So that's kind of standard length of time that you would want to give yourself and the folks that, kind of a strategy for how you might want to approach this. If you're responding to an NIH grant, there's this SF 424 instructions for research grants. There's separate instructions for training grants, like if you're going to put in for an individual K or something like that. And you would want to make sure that you're familiar with some of those. And they're PDFs now too, so it's nice. You can do you can search for certain terms and stuff in there. Folks that are supporting you will know most of these rules and be able to, assist you. But there's certain instructions in there that you're just going to want to know. And I'll show you some later in here, like, what do they want to see in a project narrative statement? What do they want to see in a project summary statement? What should you be kind of planning to put in your research strategy? And so you're going to want to, know that you've read those specific instructions yourself and not just rely on an administrative person that's kind of supporting you on how you should be doing that. And of course, you all should be having mentors and other colleagues that you can lean on for, advice as you're going through stuff as well. The one thing I want to point out is often people will be responding to a specific program announcement. or specific request for applications or funding opportunity announcements. That's what these acronyms stand for. And they all have these SF 424 baseline instructions as their backbone that they say refer to and follow, but they often list specific requirements in the RFA itself. How much money you might be limited to apply for, what your project certainly has to address, certain page limitations, other documents that they want you to include that you wouldn't find in the in the standard instructions. So if you are responding to a specific solicitation, it's your responsibility to carefully read that through thoroughly so that you understand everything that it's asking you. Often there's also a section in there about review criteria, which is really helpful for you to read through, because that's what they're going to be telling the reviewers that are going to be looking at your application, and you can get some clues as to what they're asking reviewers to kind of focus on. This is just a snapshot of a table that's right out of the SF 424 instructions, which kind of gives you some of the main documents that need to be included and what they're expecting in terms of page limitations and whatnot. So like for the research strategy, most of the times you'll have 12 pages in it, and you'll find your program in here. So like here's an RO1, some of these other programs you could be responding to as a special solicitation. And in the SF 424 instructions for training grants, they'll have a similar table for this that will tell you what documents you can expect to put in and what your standard page limits for those documents might be. You'll obviously need to know that as you're preparing your research strategy. One thing to note about biosketches, and you guys should probably already know this and have updated your biosketch, but effective January of 2022, NIH put out a new template for biosketches. And so it's important that you use the newest template. Some of the components of it have been renamed and have changed. And I think in the part 2, there might be a slide on this as well. So developing a budget, that's something that's really kind of difficult for folks to get their heads around. Like, how do I do this? It's not anything that, people have typically received in any of their training programs, certainly not in their hardcore education. So what are some things to consider? Well, first of all, how much can you apply for, right? You need to know that, because everything starts from there and you're going to kind of back in. The other thing you need to know is how much time do you need on the project? And that's twofold. One is, how much time do I think I'm going to devote to this project? But also there might be some particular funding gaps in your own funding portfolio. And you're saying, I'm looking for 30% or I'm looking for 40% effort. I need to build that in right from the get-go. And then, are you going to require any specific consultants that you're going to have to pay? Are you going to be required to collaborate with another institution? That's another sub-budget to this that you've got to be thinking about. And certainly if you're going to have a subcontract on your budget, you need to build that into your timeline, because that will affect certainly your timeline, because you've got to have the budget from the subrecipient institution signed off from their institution, so that you can incorporate it into your documents that ultimately you have to submit to grants and contracts for their review. So you've got to, as you're thinking that backwards timeline that we just reviewed, build in extra time for dealing with any institutions that you have to collaborate with. Also, what other personnel are going to be critical to your project? And then what other resources are you going to need? You're going to need biostats. Will you be using the CTRC for some clinical research? Will you be doing animal research? Will you have samples that are going to have to be analyzed by specialty corps on campus, or even sent off to other institutions, for which you'll again have to be working with them on what their pricing structure is and things like that. This is certainly information that the folks that are supporting you in your application, they're not going to know what you need. You're going to have to be prepared to bring that information to them. They may or may not be able to help you with finding how much that stuff's going to cost. So you may need to be prepared to have those conversations with, a specialty lab or whatever, to say, hey, here's what I'm planning to do. What's it going to cost me to do this? And again, those are things that you want to be building into your timeline. You don't want to be doing this, on the fly just a couple of days before your budget has to be basically finalized to be submitted to grants and contracts for review. I want to make a comment about key persons because there are two definitions of key person. So the NIH definition is that this is a person that's going to be involved at your project on more of a high level, involved in study design. They typically have, advanced degrees. And so that's what they would be considering as a key person. So when you're filling out the budget templates, again, you might not be doing this, but somebody supporting you would. There's a section where you would identify somebody as a key person or somebody just as a, as a non-key person. And so that separates that role in the eyes of the NIH. Our institution, however, follows a definition that basically anybody involved in the project from their perspective is a key person. And so the really critical piece there is that person has to have completed the annual financial conflict of interest statement. If there's individuals on your project that haven't completed their certification, grants and contracts will hold up their review until that person can complete their disclosure. And then they'll move that on. So you want to make sure that you don't get stuck in that loop. So anybody that's on your budget, you should make sure you're having conversations with them to ensure that they've already completed that certification. That certification is annual. Usually grants and contracts will send a reminder or notification that it's due. And it's usually in the fall if I can remember correctly. So that's really the big nuance between key persons. There are some required trainings and certifications that may be asked of you at the time that NIH is working to fund your grant, or even that our own institution will want to make sure is in place before you submit, like the financial conflict of interest disclosure. If you're a trainee, your training grant is going to require that you have completed the responsible conduct of research at some point during your training. That's going to be one requirement. If you're doing any kind of human subjects research, you're obviously going to have to complete the city courses, and grants and NIH grants management would want to see that certification before they're going to approve you as a PI to conduct funded human subjects research. I put good clinical practice on here. It's not typically required, although in one of our renewals for the CCTSI, they did actually require that the folks that were listed as key personnel in our notice of grant award had completed the good clinical practice training course. So we had to scramble and have half a dozen folks really complete that so that I could submit their certification so we could get our next year of our grant funded. But that's only happened one time, which was I don't understand. I mean, it might have been one particular grants management specialist that kind of was really kind of going by the book, but we haven't had that request since then. And then if you're doing any animal research, obviously you've got to go through their training in order to be able to be added to an animal research protocol. So some comments on where you might be looking for some of the other information that you might need to put into your grant budget. So this is just to kind of steer you to where some of this information might live at our institution. So, if you're going to be looking for biostats support, just a couple of comments there. You can find information on the CCTSI website, and then there's a biostats center on campus. It's called CETA, Center for Innovative Design. It's partially funded by the CCTSI. One of the things that we provide to them is a base budget that allows them to support statisticians that have dedicated time to meet with investigators who are wanting to put together a grant proposal so that you can have discussions with them about appropriate research design right at the front of your thinking. And that time that they can dedicate to you is free to you as an investigator up front like that, and is funded by the CCTSI, but the School of Medicine also supports some of that. So you should know that those resources exist for you. If you're going to be doing any clinical research that might use the CCTSI CTRC, you can go onto our website and under the resources tab, find a lot of information about what the CTRC is. Our pricing structure is in those pages as well. The CCTSI website, if you've never been there, is a wealth of information anyways. I mean, you could get lost in there for hours, but there's lots of information about pilot program opportunities that we have, about training opportunities that we have. So I think, just as an aside, it's a great place for investigators to look to find resources that might support their research and training. If you're going to be doing animal care and you need to understand kind of how to build your budget around what it might cost for what you want to do, you can send an email to that address right there and request to set up an appointment with somebody. You can walk through what you think you're needing to do, and they can direct you to how you can get access to what it's going to cost to purchase your animals, what it's going to cost to house your animals, if you're going to be doing procedures down there in their facility, what that costs. Because you really want to build an accurate budget, right? Doesn't do any good to put a bunch of stuff in there and then realize that what you wanted to do is costing far more than you had any idea about. So it's better to know what those costs are and get them in your grant budget up front, because you can't ask for your budget to be increased once it's actually awarded. A couple of other resources. One of the things that's big in study design, research design now, is how you're going to disseminate the information that you gather. Is it just only publications? If you're working with communities, things like that. So we have a D&I course that has a consultation service that is free. So you can have a discussion with a group of experts and talk about what it is you're planning to do, and really think about, okay, it's not just about getting the work done, it's about getting the work out as well. And so that's a great resource. There is plenty of information at the university on their research site. And I know that there's lots of work continuously going into the pages that are behind this website that you see that would be much more useful and helpful for investigators in finding where information lives on campus. And we've got folks in the CCTSI that are working with that group as well to provide information. And there's going to be link outs and things like that to various websites, so people aren't duplicating information and it can stay accurate and helpful. We also have a community engagement consult. So if you're doing community engaged work, it's always useful to get a consult from them so that you can leverage their expertise in designing what your project might be. If you're planning to conduct clinical research at University Hospital or Children's Hospital, here's some names that you could reach out to, because ultimately, again, you need to get pricing for what it is that you're planning to do. And those are the folks that can help you out there. Okay, so I'm just going to switch gears a little bit as we work up to an example that we'll walk through on how to prepare a budget. But over the several years that I've been giving this information, folks have asked to have a little bit of information about what is this F&A, what's facilities and administration, and why do you have to include it? And the bottom line is that this is a funding source that's absolutely critical to the university to be able to provide research facilities for people to conduct their research. This stuff isn't free. It's supporting wet labs, supporting vivariums, having the infrastructure to review and submit grants, all relies on a funding source. And so the government understands that, and they allow the university to add these costs in. It's a very sophisticated calculation that our institutional administration goes through to present the proper information to the federal government that says, this is our overhead rate for running a research institution. And so you can see there that it supports maintenance costs for the laboratories, the classrooms, the vivarium, the portion of utilities that are applicable to our research enterprise, the portion of our finance operations that are applicable to supporting the research enterprise, procurement operations, human resources, all of these things that are part of the institutional infrastructure that supports getting research done here. And so it is a percent of every direct dollar spent on a grant. There are things that by classification are excluded from this, from being charged F&A. And one of the things is equipment that costs more than $5,000. And the rationale there being that, typically equipment in scientific instrumentation costs a lot more than that. But really, aside from the activities of the procurement operations at the university to, issue a purchase order, deal with the contracting terms for the vendor, and for finance to issue a check, there's not a lot of additional overhead that goes into, supporting the instrument. And so, the justifying why the institution should get 55.5% of a $100,000 instrument just on a single purchase doesn't make sense. So they allow us to exclude equipment over 5,000. Patient care provided by the hospitals, that any of those costs are excluded from the F&A calculation as well. Subcontract expenses, because the subcontract institution will charge their own overhead in your budget, as you'll see. Except that the rules do allow our institution to collect its overhead on the first $25,000 of expenses on a subcontract arrangement that's as part of your budget. The rationale being that there was grants and contracts work involved, there was contracting work involved in issuing the subcontract, there's finance work involved in receiving, reviewing invoices and paying those other institutions. So they do allow a one-time exception for the university to take a little bit of its own overhead on the first part of a subcontract expense. Renovations are expensive, they're excluded from the overhead. And then just recently, they've made an exception for genomics related expenses and reagents that are part of a funded project that exceeds $75,000. And the rationale there again being that that work is so expensive that it's not uncommon for you to perhaps have a funded project that's focused on genomics, and that the supply budget's $250,000, and that might just be a couple of orders, right? So again, that same kind of thinking backs that up. Our current negotiated rate is 55.5%. They usually issue these rates for 3 years. We've had this rate in effect, I think, since 2016 or 2017. The federal government is just completely backlogged in receiving and reviewing the updated information for new F&A rates. And so that's been the rate that we've had for a long time. I know that the institution has submitted the information to justify a current rate that's a little bit higher than this, but it hasn't been officially awarded yet. And that's for work that's being done on campus. If you can document to grants and contracts that your work is entirely out in the community, and basically the only thing that you're doing here on campus is using your office to analyze data and stuff like that, then you can justify what's called an off-campus rate, and the F&A rate that gets included in your budget is 26%. They went to just a standard industry-funded clinical trials rate of 28%. 5 or 6 years ago, they changed this. It used to be that it was the standard, on-campus rate of 55%, but then you would exclude all of these other things like, patient care costs and whatnot. And that got really complicated. And they just decided, let's just go for a flat rate. So you just do your budget. Every expense is subject to the 28%, and it's much simpler. Training grants are typically capped at 8%, at least from the NIH. And that last bullet, if you're seeking funding from a foundation, they often have restrictions on how much F&A they might pay. So they might not accept a 55.5% institutional F&A rate, but they might say in their specific instructions that their F&A is capped at 10% or 20%, and that's all they'll pay. So grants and contracts will accept that, but you're going to have to be prepared to show them in writing where it is that the foundation that you're applying to has a capped overhead rate. So that's just to give you kind of some background. It used to be that grant solicitations, they would cap how much you could apply on a total cost. So your direct cost budget plus the applicable F&A, and say, okay, you can apply to this program, but total cost can't exceed $500,000. And so there was always this motivation for PIs to try to maximize the amount of direct costs that they could get and minimize the amount of F&A that the institution would take from their budget, right? So at least the federal government, NIH now, they've kind of taken that scenario out, and what they list in most of their solicitations are direct costs. What can you apply for in direct costs? That way, you're not playing this game between trying to exclude things from the budget that would the institution should have taken their overhead rate on and things like that. So that's less of a concern right now, that investigators see this F&A as a tax on the money that they otherwise could have gotten to support their research. So let's talk a little bit about how you might think about preparing a budget. So this is just a hypothetical example that I put together, and it's it'll be a 2-year budget. And I'm just going to point out some things that you might want to think about as you're thinking about as you're preparing to put together a budget. So first of all, you got to start thinking about personnel. So who's critical? Who do you need to fund? And so in this hypothetical example, you're the PI, so you got to have effort on the project. So you've kind of determined that you can do 20%. There's this column for calendar months, and that's what the NIH has gone to, at least, and how they want to look at effort. And so it's just, you take 12 months and you multiply it by the percent effort. That's how you get the calendar month calculation. But I like to leave both columns in, because all of these financial calculations are driven off of the actual, numeric percentage. So you kind of determine who's critical for your project, and what's a realistic amount of effort that you're going to need to fund those individuals to get your work done. So you've kind of you've determined in this example that you need a data scientist, 5%. You need a study coordinator, 50%, and you need a statistician at 5%. Ideally, you want to know who these people are. It doesn't look good to put in a budget with a whole bunch of unnamed people, which we refer to as TBD, to be determined. You sometimes see TBN, to be named. And so you're better off identifying some of these people, even if they might actually change when the grant gets funded. If they're not true key personnel, the NIH doesn't care if you put in a study coordinator, that's Jessica, and then ultimately when it gets funded, it becomes Sarah or something like that. As long as they're non-key personnel as designated by NIH, you can change who that person is without their approval. So you've made that determination, and now you need to ask somebody to get you what their salary is. And so the people supporting you will have access to that information. And remember that if you're looking at this timeline that we had kind of talked about at the beginning of this discussion, you also want to be able to know that you're using a salary that's going to be in effect at the time the grant is awarded. So you know that at the university, we all get these merit increases that are effective in July. So if you're working this budget up in October, or even like last summer, and you're likely to receive funding, in the summertime, you're going to want to take their current salary and at least inflate it by 3%. And grants and contracts will accept that. They want to know, they want to be able to verify what was the starting point. So you've listed the person's name, and they'll be able to have access in the HR system of what this person's current salary is. And then I always put a note in when I submit my documents to say salaries have been inflated by 3% in anticipation of the July merit increase of July of 2023. And they'll know that you're putting a grant in that's expected to be funded in June or May or something like that. And that's fine. They'll accept that. They just want to know, that what we're putting in there is realistic. The other thing is this concept of the NIH salary cap. If you know what that is, great. If you don't, I'm going to explain it to you. Every year, the NIH publishes a salary cap, and it basically says, we will not pay an equivalent salary that's more than this. And it's always effective in January. And the current rate is $212,100. What that means is you have to drive your budget calculations off of a salary that's no more than $212,100. This person could have an institutional salary of $250,000. They're going to get paid $250,000 by the institution, but their department can only collect from an NIH grant an equivalent salary of $212,100. And then it's up to the department to cover that difference. So that's why I have this highlighted here. If somebody has a salary that's over 212, you just knock it down to 212 and drive these calculations. And so, the way that this works is simple math. You've got a salary of $115,000 times 20%. That's the amount of salary that you're going to be requesting. These fringe benefit rates are negotiated rates. And they're published on the Grants and Contracts website, and the people that are supporting you will know what these rates are. But those are the rates that have to be put in. Even though the university, we get paid our benefits by the benefits that we select, right? So some individuals might have actual fringe benefits rates that are in the 50%. I've got some people that have 60%. That's because they're coordinators. They might have a lower salary, but they're taking all of the family benefits, right? And so their benefit structure is higher. So when I'm actually paying them on my grant, I am paying them 60% benefit rates. But what I've only been allowed to ask for is the published negotiated rates for these job classifications. So that is something that we'll talk about in part 2 when we talk about tracking your budget.
How do you make up that difference, Tim?
So you make up that difference by, that switched. You make up that difference by either reducing the actual effort that you're going to support for these people when the grant funds, or, cutting down wherever you can in other places to free up what you think you're going to need to be able to make your budget balance when you're actually in practice and it's funded.
But that's not something that you would do with what you submit. So that's a post award. Right. Okay.
Right. That's a post award event. Or if you know in anticipation that that's kind of where you're at, you can build in some cushion in other places. So you can pad some of these costs. So, you might only be, thinking that you're going to spend $750 on computing fees, and you can put it in there at $1,250. And, when you write your justification, you just inflate the number of hours a little bit here and there to build a cushion into your grant budget. And, some people will tell you that they try to do that anyways, because it's not uncommon for NIH to cut your budget once they've decided to fund your project. You might have asked for, $300,000 and they'd cut it 10% across the board or something like that.
Yeah. And when you said the fringe benefit rate is a negotiated rate, can you put in higher than that, or will the university? That's it. So OGC will flag that, right? So you can't say, I know it's annoying because it doesn't acknowledge reality, but but that's it. Okay.
Right. And then if you have a different rate up here, when they send their comments back to you, they will have scratched through that and said,
that's right,
this rate has to be this.
But that's not on the NIH side. That's on the OGC side.
Right.
Yeah.
Right. So just something to be aware of. But again, the folks that are supporting you will get the right values for you, at least in that part of your budget. and they'll kind of depend upon you for these other aspects of the budget. So that's the nuance in the personnel, which is typically the most expensive part of your budget. So you want to pay close attention to that. And then, in this hypothetical example, we've got an analyzer that you're going to need. You've got some travel to a conference that you're going to want to go to. You've got some project-related supplies. I just added this note in here that, and you'll see it in the sample budget justification that I provided here, that you're going to need to provide, specific details, categorized details about how did you arrive at $3,000. It's not sufficient to just put in $3,000 and in your budget justification to say, I request a supplies budget of $3,000. They're going to want to know, generally what that is. Here's the comment about, in this hypothetical example, you're going to be collaborating with CSU. CSU has an overhead rate of 52%. You would develop a budget very similar to this, but it would have the CSU costs, and it would be back up to this. So, it would be a page or two after this in your grant application where they would see the detail around the direct costs that you're asking for and the CSU indirect costs that you've included. And then in this example, you've got some hospital-based clinical research costs, and so that you budgeted that at $7,000, and then you've got some some service core stuff and some advertising for your study. These roll up to 250 here. So this cell here is just sums up all of this stuff here, and that's your direct cost. So an important point that I will just state here, it's nuanced. It's pretty detail heavy in the sense that somebody's going to help you understand this. But the direct cost in a budget like this includes the overhead at the subcontracted institutions. Okay, that's one thing that you have to understand. If you're responding to a solicitation that says you can submit a budget that is capped at direct costs of $250,000, they will usually add exclusive of subrecipient F&A. That means that when you're creating your budget up to $250,000, you do not want to include this value right here, right? That's not included in the direct cost cap of a solicitation, especially if it specifically says exclusive of subrecipient F&A. So that's just one kind of nuanced point. In the overall grant budget, it is included part of the direct cost, but in a solicitation cap, you would want to back that out, and folks should know that and be able to help you. And then the other comment that I want to make here is that in the calculation of overhead, you take your direct cost and you back out of it. The subrecipient costs, the total cost, the direct and the overhead. You back out any hospital-based costs, and you back out any equipment costs. So you take your direct costs minus $7,000, minus the sum of these two values, minus $7,500, and then you calculate that at 55.5%. That's what the people supporting you should know, and will do accurately. And then in the first year, remember, our institution gets to take its own overhead on the first $25,000 of these expenses. So then you add into this calculation, you just add 25,000 times 0.555, and that's the amount of additional overhead that the institution will put into your budget. Again, nuanced, heavily detailed, not your responsibility to know exactly how to calculate that, but you should understand what builds that up in the background.
Yeah, one other item I'll say is sort of generically, Tim has graciously provided templates, these calculating Excel documents. Have you guys used these before, or is this? No. Okay. So with grants, not infrequently, particularly if you're at multiple institutions, for example, you're calculating, salary, FTE, there should be templates around Excel documents that calculate all of these things for you. So So when you're starting out, before you get going, you should ask your administrators, or remind your administrators, I have an appointment here, like this is where some of my budget comes from or whatnot, and they'll give you Excel spreadsheets that calculate. And then similarly, this is a template, but there are often Excel spreadsheets that will do calculations that you can actually submit for some grants where they'll do all these calculations for you. So ask around for those, because those are incredibly useful and will prevent you from making mistakes like, how you deal with F&A or whatnot.
Yeah. And the folks specifically that support you may have their own templates that
That's right. Yeah. So you want to Google and see if you can find, like, if you're starting to, build something like this, like Google and see if you can find it. But first thing to do is ask the administrators in your own place, what kind of Excel spreadsheets they have for handling the budget. And you'll see that these things already exist.
Exactly. Yeah. Great comments. So then the next page is year 2. And so, when I do this, I just create one Excel spreadsheet. It's got a tab, year 1, year 2, blah, blah, blah. And so nothing, really different here. Just want to note that, you don't need to purchase your analyzer twice. So you wouldn't include that in an out year budget. You always want to have a discussion with the folks supporting you about incorporating salary increases that might happen that go along with the 3% annual merit. Some programs, for instance, the program that funds the CCTSI, it's so large they don't let us do that. They just expect us to absorb that in our budget. Other programs will allow you to incorporate that. So you just got to make sure you know what somebody knows what those rules are that you're allowed to do for the specific program that you're applying to. Everything else is pretty much, the same. So, we no need to spend any time on that. And then lastly, I just, I build this in, usually at the bottom of the first tab for year 1, but you want to roll up all your costs. You want to know, for years 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, whatever, what were you asking for direct costs? What are you asking for overhead, the total costs each year, what the total roll up is? And then here's that's that comment, less subrecipient F&A. So this is that direct cost that subtracted out the CSU overhead in year 1 and in year 2. So you can say, okay, I'm asking now my direct cost for this budget, $306,000. If you're capped at 300, you got some work to go back and cut some expenses out. If you can apply for 400, you've got room to go and add more costs that you can justify. So that's just kind of the final comment on drafting a budget. You will be asked to submit a detailed budget justification. And this is how we do it. Again, there's templates out there, and the folks that are supporting you might have specific ways that they like to say things. But basically, you want to justify each of the people that you're putting on your budget. Who are they? What's the level of support in calendar months? They do not want to see 10% FTE, 20% FTE. They want to see 2.4 calendar months. Dr. XXX, who is this person? Why are they qualified to be the PI of this program? What generally are they going to be doing in the management of this project? And it doesn't only mean how are they going to conduct their science? What are they going to do about managing all of these things that we're talking about? Reporting, tracking budgets, things like that. You can make general comments around that. No need to belabor this. You can read over this at your own, at your own leisure. Just, you got to understand that you're asking somebody to fund these people. You got to tell them, why are they important? Who are they? Why are they qualified? What will they be doing? Kind of a thing. You're going to want to justify, why do you need a piece of equipment? You're going to need a quote for that piece of equipment as well, so that they know that you're asking for $7,500 for an analyzer, and somebody's actually going to sell that to you for $7,500, kind of a thing. Travel, you want to break down your travel request. How did you roll this up? You got some airfare, you can just spitball that. What does it cost to stay in a hotel at the city that your conference is going to be in? And then the university has a $75 per diem rate, so you can throw that in for per diem expenses. Supplies, again, here's a cut and paste out of the actual directions. They want some specific details around your supply budget. So just make sure you understand what they want to see as you put in the details to how you're going to roll up to your $3,000 request. You're going to have also a detailed budget and a detailed budget justification for your subcontract. So you could put a comment in there, detailed budget justification provided for activities for the planned subcontract. And then those will be attached in the pages behind this. And then you have other direct costs. And I've just kind of listed some stuff in here that you can read through at your leisure. I've cut and pasted some comments related to, what's this? Patient care costs. So that's the hospital-based costs that's on your budget. So I want to make sure that we have some time for a break here. So some other common documents that you're going to have to be preparing that will roll up for your application. Obviously, the research strategy. That's really what you might, as a scientist, think is your project. So this is all you, and help from your mentors, help from your colleagues, but this is your 12 pages that you get to describe what you're going to do. Preliminary data, all of the other pieces that go in. The specific aims page is a 1-page that's addition to your 12-page research strategy. So you don't have to plan space for your specific aims in this 12-page document. It's a completely separate PDF that gets uploaded. It's required to have a summary, and here's the instructions. It's required to have a narrative, 3 sentences at most. Here's the instructions. Both of those, again, are separate PDFs that get uploaded to the application. So, and then you've got an equipment section, which lists the equipment that you have available to you to support this project. So you want to be thinking about, where are you going to be performing most of this work, and what is the critical infrastructure that you have access to support that. There's a facilities and other resources page. I've got some information here. We provide some of this on our website that has some institutional language that you can cut and paste. But also this is, again, specific to the environment that you have available to support your research. If you're going to do clinical research, there's a whole bunch of documents that you're going to have to be prepared to draft that go into this application. And so your folks will be able to support you. I tell people this is where it's great to reach out to colleagues and mentors. A lot of this stuff can be canned language that you can steal from somebody else and not have to spend a lot of your own time, drafting this. And then you can tweak those documents as necessary to apply specifically to your project. Obviously, this is one big one here that has to be, accurate and applicable directly to your own work. Draw your attention, I think this might be the last slide. Draw your attention to a new data management and sharing policy that went into effect January of this year. There's some information on that research tools website that the university has. Melissa Hendel, who's the chief informatics officer, her team is drafting some canned templated language for this, but the important part is that it's now required. It's not subject to review, so the reviewers don't evaluate this and it doesn't affect your score, but it is actually built into the contract of the award. So you are held responsible for following your data sharing and management plan. And so it's really critical that you understand. Don't wait till the last minute to start thinking about this piece. I believe this is the last slide. Wanted you all to know, don't know exactly where you are in your careers, but the CCTSI has this K to R transition program. If you have a K and you're working on your first R, you can apply to this program. The requirements are right here. The timelines are here. This is a great resource for you guys. It is made up of folks that are experienced scientific reviewers, have been on many scientific review panels, and they will review your grant using the NIH criteria and provide detailed feedback as if you got summary statements from the NIH. And so it's an opportunity to have somebody critically evaluate what you're proposing, point out weaknesses that you can address before you actually submit. In order for this to be successful for you, you need to be organized with your work at the prescribed time points. And it's a great resource and it's free. And then there's also a pre-K. If you're working towards a K, you can do the same thing. And so all of that information is on our website.
Yeah, I participated in that, and that's very useful, both the pre-K and the K to R transition. I don't know if folks here on the class have done that. What I would say about that is they can propose sometimes some very major changes. So more important than getting all the little details like in there, it's better to cover like a lot of items briefly and just have something, even if it's placeholder language in for the particularly the pre-K program. But the more you give them, the more they'll be able to comment on. That was great, Tim. Thank you.
Yeah, okay, great. And so that concludes part one. Thanks you guys for all staying awake for that.
Can I ask a quick question about the pre-K program?
Sure.
Since I'm anticipating this in the next year for me, the timing for when that happens compared to when you're going to submit, is it kind of like a rolling thing? Is it specifically designed to match up with certain NIH deadlines as far as when to submit for a pre-K review?
Yeah, I don't know, all of the details, but I know that they designed that program to line up with the standard K submission dates. And so that's, that should help you out there. Definitely go to the CCTSI website, look at the pre-K information, and you can always send an email to the program administrators to help you make sure that you fully understand what that timeline is.
Okay, thank you.
I just posted the dates and the times and the website. It's excellent. Did anyone else have any other questions?
Great. Well, I was hoping to end a few minutes earlier than this, but is it reasonable, Laurent, to come back in at 11:05 or 11:10?
Yeah, that's fine. That's fine.
Okay. Well, then let's do 11:05. That gives folks an opportunity to go hit the restroom or whatnot, and we'll start with part two because I'd really like to make sure I get you guys done by noon.
Thank you.